Snow White has had a huge fall in its second weekend, one that a lot of people couldn't predict, especially the trades. In fact, I feel really bad for doing this, but we're going to focus on Anthony for a while because he's been getting it wrong since the beginning. And reporting what he has is more about feelings than the facts and the direction that this film was always pointed. But this fall, this collapse, this disaster has a lot to it. So let's jump into it. Here we go. But before we get started, just a quick reminder, double check you're still subscribed to the channel, hit the like button while you're down there, turn notifications on, and let's get to the video. Disney's live-action Snow White, which released on March 21st of this year, just a couple weeks ago, is a certified disaster at this point. You've got a film budget ranging between $270 and $350 million, believe what you will, but it's an incredibly expensive movie, especially when you're there for 3 London summers shooting it. And that was confirmed by Rachel Zegler. The opening weekend was a terrible disappointment at $43 million. Well, $43 million and change, depending upon who you believe, and an overall performance globally of only $87.3 million. That is a disaster, considering when you look at other films that were similar, that is a disaster. And if you look at other films that were similarly released, which we're going to do towards the end of the video, you'll see how stark the contrast is between then and now when it comes to live action. But more importantly, Snow White had some problems with its star power. Now, it wasn't just that Gal Gadot has mid-level acting skills at best, or that Rachel Zegler's voice can be grating, despite the fact that that's something that she's supposedly known for. I don't think I agree with that, but the Shill media was very driven to talk about this film as a billion-dollar potential, a tentpole, something that Disney could point to and be proud about. And when you get to the heart of it, it was always going to be very disappointing, especially for Disney. They knew this thing didn't have a shot at $100 million opening weekend here in the States. They also didn't think it had much of a shot to get over $70 or $80 million. How do I know that? Well, the trade media was reporting that Snow White's long lead tracking was going to be okay. They were looking at a potential box office forecast of about $63 to $70 million. Most people settled a little bit lower, like myself, below $65 million. And while that was kind of fair, it wasn't good. You have to remember, even The Little Mermaid opened over $100 million, and that was something that was being, well, a comparative for this film. Because, well, let's see, you had a racial swap of the primary character and a complete divergence in favor of the communist, socialist, neo-Marxist messaging that you get with this kind of a remake. And that's the problem. It deviated so wildly from the original source material that it literally turned its audience off. Now, they were pumping this narrative for a reason nobody's been talking about, and I think we should. This was going to be the best opening for a Rachel Zegler film that she'd ever had, because she's not exactly a box office draw, which I have been saying for a very long time. Her biggest opening to date was that failure of that Hunger Games film, the prequel, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. That thing made a box office opening of $44.6 million. In other words, she's never had a winner, and this wouldn't be one either. Moving on, let's take a look at what Variety had to say with I think the only Variety offering I've selected here, that the Snow White aim was for $50 million. Well, why was that? Because the numbers had already started to collapse, and they already had an inkling that pre-sales were not going well. Shifting the goalposts made the film look a little bit better when they were saying somewhere between 45 and 55 million in 4,200 North American theaters. We, of course, know it didn't get there, and we also know it didn't reach its global guess of $100 million. And within a couple days after its release, we get the true story. A ho-hum Snow White opens to $43 million. Well, 42 point change, but hey, who's counting? And I have to say, I respect Anthony for admitting that this wasn't going very well, and what poisoned this princess at the box office is the correct question. Despite the terrible PR and obviously the two sides that were involved in what is a regional conflict halfway around the globe, that didn't help all that much either. An 87.3 million global start is pretty low, considering that even Anthony's willing to admit that a $270 million production is really harming this film. And unsurprisingly, Anthony decided to dive into perhaps some political division that was driving the lack of butts and seats. Except the data found something different than what they were all looking for. The film was well received or well attended in areas where you had the red side of the aisle. Why is that? Well, because believe it or not, Disney still has some that believe it's a family company. And guess what? They actually go to movies. It's odd to me that Disney is shunning the audience that actually goes to movies and has families and a future for the Disney company, since it relies so heavily on nostalgia. And yet, on the other side of the equation, where it seems fewer and fewer families are being formed or created for a lot of reasons, and some very obvious reasons, they didn't seem to be quite up there with the same kind of numbers. Very odd. And yet, going into the second weekend, Anthony dropped this story, which I've already talked about a little bit, but despite all the controversy, Anthony expected Snow White to come out on top again this last weekend. I said that is not going to happen. Guess who's right? Well, culture, once again. But it's bigger than that, because Anthony fully expected that Jason Statham's Working Man would be competitive, just not quite big enough to put Snow White to sleep. But it was a rated R film designed for streaming, so what do you want? And we're going to end with this Deadline article from Anthony before we get to some other numbers I think are more relevant. Jason Statham's Working Man beat out Snow White this weekend by $1 million. In other words, it's in first place. And that's surprising, because it shouldn't have as broad appeal in a box office that, well, is more four-quadrant driven with their tent poles. And as Jason Statham has a lot of support from a very dedicated group of individuals, Snow White should have easily beaten it, right? In his Sunday morning write-through, which as you're watching this is probably yesterday, Jason Statham's Working Man scared Snow White into second place, 15.2 million to 14.2 million. And I have a feeling Working Man's going to do a little better when we look at the final numbers on Monday or Tuesday. What's more important here is that the Statham project has a chance to be very profitable, while the Snow White project will probably lose a couple $100 million. And I have no trouble saying that or predicting it, because, well, this film is a dumpster fire, and it always has been. Rewriting the 1937 animated classic into a modern audience story would push away any last hopes it had for making a profit, because there is no such thing as a modern audience, and that sales pitch is not only hollow, it's laughable at this point. And to be fair, what do you look for in movie stars? You look for consistency, and Jason Statham, he's consistency. Well, to be fair, I guess Rachel Zegler is consistently flopping, but realistically, we were looking at nearly a 70% fall off from weekend to weekend for Snow White. It had a late resurgence on Sunday and a little bit on Saturday in the matinees to bring the film a little bit more in line with a fall off for a Marvel film at 66%. I thought 64% would be disastrous. It looked like 70% was going to be the actual number, but 66% feels appropriate when you think about the demons that possess this film. At the end of the day, it looks like The Chosen is in a position to, well, embarrass everybody with how little was spent on the film and its week one release of $11.49 million. There's a chance that as you're watching this video, those two films flipped and Snow White somehow magically found its way to third. I don't think that's the case, but I do feel like it's worth mentioning that a faith-based film, The Chosen, The Last Supper Part 1, is somehow competitive in a market that just spends money like it's water, especially if you're Disney. And in this case, it's throwaway, polluted, toxic water when it comes to Snow White. I also think it's worth mentioning something else equally embarrassing, especially for the Marvel branded element of Disney, that Captain America Brave New World still, after 7 weeks, has not crossed $200 million domestically in the box office. After 7 weeks. But to give Anthony a break from the spotlight, because we can't all get it right all the time. Believe me, I know I get it wrong a lot. The biggest one of all was my thoughts around Barbie. I didn't realize how many toxic women were out there. But Screen Rant has decided that predicting Snow White's final box office total was going to be an easy mode for them. And it looks like so far they may be on track. That disappointing opening weekend was, well, probably a wake-up call for the Shills, or at least it should have been. Screen Rant starts with the fact that this didn't have any resonance anywhere, especially not globally, with a $43 million entry in all of the markets that it released in. This film showed that, well, there wasn't any interest, none whatsoever. Probably because of the political stance of the parties involved, but also because, well, it wasn't going to reflect a faithful adaptation. And that's a big problem with Disney these days. You're seeing a lot of foreign markets fall out of love with Disney, and it's no wonder. Because of its incredibly soft start, if we're going to be nice, this film had the potential to have absolutely no legs. In fact, it proved to have no legs based on what we found out this last weekend. But it surprised me that Screen Rant kind of is hitting the nail on the head, which is something they are not prone to do. And to reinforce their idea that this film wouldn't have any legs, this paragraph kind of highlights it all. Snow White's going to face some stiff competition in its third weekend. The Minecraft movie is going to definitely challenge some of the potential viewers to make a choice, because I don't want to spend $16 for each of the members of my household to go see something that I know is a disaster. I want to see just how much of a disaster Minecraft is. Get it? Even more, the obvious thing is that Minecraft is going to be the #1 movie in the country. And if things hold the way they have been, Snow White's going to continue to move down the list fairly steadily, maybe even precipitously. The only saving grace, according to Screen Rant, is that Mufasa the Lion King actually opened up lower than Snow White, with a $35 million initial offering, which I predicted was going to happen way back then with a different animated film doing very, very well. But, as they point out accurately over at Screen Rant, Mufasa faced no competition in order to benefit from a set of long legs and nothing interesting to watch. People wanted to go and experience the uncanny valley for themselves and the terrible storyline that kind of breaks some of the Lion King lore. Set all of that aside, it made itself useful by exceeding $700 million, but there are a lot of arguments to be made why that film still wasn't profitable, because it cost an awful lot to make and a ton to advertise. But let's get to the heart of the matter. What did Screen Rant think? Well, they think even lower than me, with a film that'll be worth about $250 million at the end of the day. And I will agree with them. I think it's going to finish under $300 million, but $250? Ooh, that's even lower than I would say. And worse yet, Screen Rant, when they released this, didn't realize it was going to fall 66%. They kind of made their estimates based off of 40 to 60% fall from previous less than successful Disney products. Here we are with the most important thing, the actual box office weekend. Now, from the numbers, and again, these are all estimates, which will be updated as late as Tuesday for their accurate finishes. Let's take a look at A Working Man at 15.215 million, Snow White at 14.2, and The Chosen at 11.4. Wow, that's a tight grouping of films. And a surprising one as well. If it's to be believed, and domestically Snow White is sitting at 66.8 million, which I have no reason to doubt, Snow White may have a hard time getting to 100 million by its third weekend. And if that's the case, well, this may go down in history as the worst live-action flop that Disney's ever released. I think we can all imagine why. But hey, those are the end of my thoughts. What are yours? Audience participation time as always, and those comments are very important to me, so let me know in the comments below if this is what you expected. Do you predict that the film will be lower than $300 million, and if so, what do you think it'll be? And finally, did you see the film, and are you in agreement that maybe this shouldn't have been made at all? Again, let me know those thoughts down in the comments section below. And as always, be sure to take care of yourself, take care of others, and until next time, see ya for real.